Cyberspace, the final frontier of war? Nicole Periroth reveals that every country on Earth right now is investing, or virtually, is investing in offensive cyber weapons. Check it out, leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Over the years, one of the people who has kept me informed as a subscriber to the New York Times about what's going on with cybersecurity around the world has been Nicole Periroth. She is the cybersecurity reporter with the New York Times, and just came out with a startling new book. I believe the title is "The Cyber Weapons Arms Race," and the headline and the subhead is "This is how they tell me the world ends." Although I may have that backwards, and Periroth, P-E-R-L-R-O-T-H. If you're looking for her on wherever you buy your books online or whatever it may be, but it's just an absolutely extraordinary book. And I'm so pleased that Nicole is able to spend a little time with us on the air here today. Nicole, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I was just blown away by your book. The website for the book, by the way, is thisishowtheytellmetheworldends.com, and your Twitter handle is Nicole Periroth, N-I-C-O-L-E-P-E-R-L-R-O-T-H. So let's talk about cyber weapons and cyber arms. First of all, how real is this possibility that the next world war, should there be one, God forbid, is not fought using conventional weapons or even nuclear weapons, that it's fought using essentially the internet?
Well, I think there's no question that cyber going forward will be a core component of any war that we see. Whether we only see this sort of low-level, daily cyber conflict escalate into something where we are turning off the lights somewhere or someone is turning off the lights here remains to be seen, but it's entirely plausible. In fact, over the years, I've written about this for the New York Times, numerous instances where Russia has gotten into our power plants. They've gotten into our nuclear plants. Now they've gotten into the business enterprise networks of those nuclear plants. They haven't made the leap into the critical controls themselves. But a few years ago, the Department of Homeland Security published a screenshot that literally showed Russian hackers' hands on the controls at an American power plant. We know that they've turned off the power in Ukraine, not once, but twice. We know that we are actively trying to get into Russia's grid, and we've made a pretty loud show of it. My colleague David Sanger and I broke that story for the New York Times a couple of years ago. So all that we're really missing is some larger geopolitical trigger for one of these actors to actually turn off the lights. And we haven't had that yet, but it seems like every day we're getting a little bit closer to that inevitability.
You open the book with this extraordinary story of going to Ukraine yourself and looking at the devastation of a cyber attack there. Can you recap that for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. So, to me, this was the biggest news story I have covered in my 10 years at the Times that really just did not set in, I think, with readers the way it set in with me and other people in the cybersecurity space. But a few years ago, someone, we don't know who, they call themselves the Shadow Brokers, appeared on Twitter. This was around 2016, and they claimed to have hacked the National Security Agency. And over the next year, they started dribbling out the NSA's hacking tools. And in 2017, they dumped a hacking tool that the agency called Eternal Blue that allowed code to spread automatically in Microsoft Windows systems, which, whether you know it or not, you use Microsoft Windows. You might not have a Windows PC, but our power grid relies on Windows. Critical systems rely on Windows. Hospitals rely on Windows. So what happened in 2017 is the shadow brokers dumped the NSA's hacking tools online. They were picked up a month later by North Korean hackers that used them in a global ransomware attack, which fortunately the code had been a little sloppy, so someone was able to neutralize that attack pretty quickly. But then a month later, it was picked up again, and this time by Russia in an attack on Ukraine that decimated government agencies' data in Ukraine, that switched off the radiation monitors at the old Chernobyl nuclear site, that kept people from getting money out of ATMs, that kept people from paying for gas at gas stations, paying for train tickets at their railways, kept their postal service from getting packages out to the intended recipients, kept people from getting their pension checks. And it didn't just hit Ukraine. That attack zoomed out of Ukraine and hit any business or entity that had anyone working remotely from Ukraine. So it hit Pfizer, it hit FedEx, it hit Merck. That year, actually, Merck had to tap into the CDC's emergency supplies of vaccines because their vaccine production systems had been affected. It even hit Cadbury egg chocolate factories in Tasmania. It wiped out medical records for people here in the United States. It kept patients from getting treatment. So I went to Ukraine about a year and a half after that attack to just survey the wreckage for what was essentially ground zero for that attack. And I would have gone sooner, but I was pregnant and had a baby right after this happened. But even a year and a half, 2 years later, they were still picking up the pieces from that attack. And I spent several weeks there. And what Ukraine security experts told me that did the forensics for that attack was, listen, this was really bad. This was the most destructive and costly cyber attack in history. It cost victims northwards of $10 billion. It's the most costly attack we'd ever seen. But what they said in Ukraine was, listen, we're not that digitized here. Yes, this affected our ATMs and people's ability to pay for gas and get their pension checks, but our elections are still not digitized. Our hospitals really still are not digitized. People in Ukraine aren't really moving towards the Internet of Things like we have here. They really are far behind when it comes to the virtualization of their critical infrastructure. And so what they said to me in Ukraine was, listen, if you don't pay attention to what Russia is doing in Ukraine, if you don't understand the lessons here, that they are turning off our lights, wiping out our government agencies, paralyzing these systems, then you are in deep trouble, because they believed that the end target wasn't Ukraine. They believed the end target was the United States. And that when an attack of that nature came directly for us, that we would be in much worse shape, because we are so much more connected, so much more wired, so much more virtualized than Ukraine is. And they believed ultimately that that was just a dry run for some future attack on us.
And they did that while Trump was president, knowing that he would not hold Russia to account?
Well, I mean, Trump made it pretty clear that he would not hold Putin directly to account. You know, we all saw Trump standing there in Helsinki saying something to the effect of, Putin said it wasn't Russia. I don't see any reason why it would be. When the entire intelligence agency community and cybersecurity community had determined that it was Russia. So, yes, you know, in some ways, Russia got a free pass on that one, even though it hit so many American businesses and critical infrastructure, too.
Remarkable. Nicole Periroth is with us. The new book, The Cyber Weapons Arms Race. This is how they tell me the world ends. We'll continue the conversation. To what extent is this something that has been largely isolated with regard to, you know, Russia, U.S., Ukraine, as opposed, and, you know, in North Korea's, the high-profile things that we hear about, you know, North Korea going after Sony. How deep is this? How, for example, China, India, Maybe even some of the lesser-known players, Pakistan, countries, because we know North Korea has really, strengthened their. I mean, you write in your book about how they recruited, as I recall, hundreds of thousands of people. How broad is this around the world, or is this still something that's unique to a few super cyber-savvy countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was given access to some of the Snowden documents back in 2013. And among the documents in that trove that I've reported on was a classified national intelligence estimate from 2009, 2010, which looked at the cyber threat landscape and nation-state capabilities that could come back to attack the United States. And at that time, they were really focused on the usual suspects. China was hacking our intellectual property at a rate that was unprecedented. Russia was the most sophisticated adversary we faced in cyberspace. But until then, most of the attacks we saw coming from Russia were really just traditional espionage and then also a large amount of cyber crime. North Korea and Iran were in a different category back then. They were assessed to be have the motivation and the ambition to do harm using cyber means, but they really lacked the capability. And 3 years later, I knew from my post at the New York Times that those two countries, North Korea and Iran, had come along much quicker than the United States intelligence community had given them credit for. They were nowhere near the sophistication of China or Russia, but what they had pulled off using rudimentary code at Sony Pictures in attacks on the Sands Casino, which Iran did because they were upset with something Sheldon Adelson had said about the U.S. bombing Tehran. What they were able to do with those rudimentary attacks blew U.S. officials away. It still caused damage. They weren't using the sophisticated techniques that we used here, or that China and Russia were using, but they were able to do quite a bit of damage. 8 years later, we are in a vastly different landscape. North Korea is much more sophisticated, fortunately or unfortunately for some. They have determined that their best case is to use cyber as a means to skirt sanctions, which means hacking things like Bitcoin, cryptocurrency exchanges to generate badly needed cash so they can get back to their nuclear weapons programs. Iran was handcuffed by the Iran nuclear deal. So when Trump canceled that deal, we saw a huge wave of new Iranian cyber attacks. And these days, they are the most prolific adversary that the United States faces today. But in doing this book, what I learned is that basically every country on Earth, maybe with the exception of Antarctica, is stockpiling offensive cyber weapons for their own purposes. It might just be surveillance,
please, for just 1 minute.
It might be because they need to reach out and touch someone. Mm-hmm.
Talking with Nicole Periroth, the cybersecurity reporter for the New York Times, author of a mind-boggling new book, The Cyber Weapons Arms Race. This is how they tell me the world ends. The website, this is how they tell me the world ends.com, and Nicole's Twitter handle, Nicole Periroth. Nicole, how, if I could ask you to kind of step into an imaginary or a forward, before we get to that, you were just summarizing for me how 8 years ago, basically, there were just a few international actors of any level of sophistication, and now that landscape has changed. You want to quickly summarize that in terms of cyber weaponry around the world, and then I have another question for you.
Well, I just think just in the last 10 years, every attack that has been discovered, unraveled, and publicized has opened up every nation state's eyes to the potential of using cyber weapons and hacking tools for espionage, for surveillance, and possibly one day for destruction. So even if India might not have a reason right now to turn off the lights in Pakistan, they are in a quickly escalating border dispute with China. And just in recent weeks, we've seen them go back and forth in hacks of each other's critical infrastructure. So every geopolitical conflict today, whether we're paying attention to it or not, is going to have some cyber element. And what I learned is that there are countries in the Gulf that will pay top dollar to any hacker that brings them a way to hack an iPhone. The going rate is $3 million. They might use that on their enemies, whether it's Qatar or Iran. But for the most part, they're using it to spy on their own people, to spy on their Twitter critics. Here in the United States, we see cyber as a necessary way to prepare the battlefield if we ever do need to turn off communication channels or power in Iran or Russia. We'll do that. And then there's this other category of countries like Finland that I learned is actually in the cyber weapons market. Now, you might not think of Finland necessarily as a very bellicose nation, but they do share a border with one of the nation's savviest predators, Russia. So they see their own reason for trying to acquire these tools in the event of a rainy day. So what I was saying just before the break was that really these days that no country, with maybe the exception of Antarctica, is not in this market, is not trying to acquire its own set of offensive cyber hacking tools.
So imagine Joe and Jane Dokes are living in Chicago, happily conducting their lives, and some country decides that they're going to take on the United States, or we decide we're going to take on some country and start a conflict, and that conflict rapidly escalates. We can all imagine if it was a nuclear conflict, we might see atomic bombs on the horizon, or we might just suddenly be vaporized. We can all imagine if there was an invasion, Pearl Harbor, we remember that, at least institutionally. What would this look like? What would it look like to the average citizen of any part of America, in this case, Chicago, for example?
Yeah, well, I think it would look, let me just back up and say, we fear the attack that would take out the power. We fear the attack that could cause a leak at a nuclear plant. We fear sort of a cyber-induced Fukushima event. But what that situation would look like is not so different from what we saw in Texas the other month, when the power went out and people's drinking water became contaminated. It was just interesting to see that we were all paying attention to the situation there. And of course, it was from an underinvestment in winterizing. But that is a situation we fear when we fear a cyber-induced kinetic attack on our critical infrastructure. Those things are entirely possible. There are adversaries in our systems. We are in their systems. Again, we're just waiting for that geopolitical hot point for someone to pull the trigger. But I actually think that no country actually wants to turn off the lights in another nation state, especially in the case of Russia and the United States, because the adversary could just turn around and do it right back to us. Essentially, it's digitally mutually assured destruction. So what I fear is a different scenario, and it's a multi-pronged coordinated attack that involves things we are already seeing here in the United States. So the attack I fear actually looks a lot like the one that was headed off a few weeks ago in Oldsmar, Florida, where hackers, we don't know who they are, broke into a water treatment facility and upped the level of lye, L-Y-E, in the water from 100 parts per million to 11,000 parts per million just ahead of the Super Bowl outside Tampa. And what if they hadn't been caught? What if that hadn't been stopped and hackers pulled off a simultaneous ransomware attack on a hospital so that that hospital could not accept new patients? I really fear, and both those things have happened. Earlier in the pandemic, Israel reported that Iran had tried to break into two of its water treatment facilities, potentially to cut water flow or to contaminate the water. So all of these things are possible, and the event I fear the most is a coordinated attack that would involve, 2 or 3 of the things we've already seen at once. And maybe a country uses cyber criminals to pull it off to maintain that degree of plausible deniability. And it would be a while before we determine who exactly was behind it and how do you respond when you don't have that level of attribution. So This is a
Absolutely.
messy space, and you can do a lot of damage with cyber, and we don't really have good deterrent strategies.